Hello, Dream Team. Welcome back to episode 3 of the A&P podcast, and I'm joined by Garret O'Moore.
Hello.
This episode, we're going to talk mainly about stress. So we're going to start off by talking about what kind of stress we're talking about, and then hopefully we're going to get onto some stress management tactics and techniques. It's such a massive topic, stress, and I don't think it's one that's going to go away anytime soon when the subject of well-being, mental health comes up. It's something that seems to be more prevalent now than in any time I can remember in my life. More talked about, more media coverage, more people are aware of stress and the impact it can have, but more people seem to be stressed or be categorizing themselves as stressed. I'm guilty of saying it quite a few times a week. I feel stressed about this, feel stressed about that. So it seems to be everywhere. But there are lots of different types of stress, or stress is at least separated into different categories. So maybe it might be a good place to start, just to kind of almost talk about the type of stress that we can talk about, or that we are going to be talking about.
Sure, okay. I suppose if you just kind of back it up a bit, one way to understand it is that we have a stress response. So that, that's your body's response to a kind of a stimuli that you perceive as either, potentially threatening, demanding, challenging, something like that. So that's the kind of, stress is sort of the reaction in the system. The triggers of the stimuli, we call those stressors. So that's kind of how you differentiate it. So you have the stressor, that's kind of like the trigger, and then your response to that, if it's perceived as, threatening, demanding, challenging, etc., you then have a stress response. So that's just kind of one way to think about it. So sometimes what we're doing is actually there's a wide array of stressors that are going to vary from person to person. But if they are perceived in a particular way, then the stress system responds.
Yeah, because if I think about the times that in my life that are really stressful, I've been very fortunate that the types of stress I've experienced have usually been trying to achieve something. They've not been sort of forced upon me so much. So exams, driving tests, sometimes there's sort of breakups of relationships, but then there's a massive emotional component in that. So there's some things that are stressful because there's, as you say there, the perception of the pressure to attain a certain outcome. But definitely with exams, not so much now actually, but certainly as a kid, because I don't think I really cared about the exam that much. Okay. In fact, I didn't really want to do it. And then, but there seemed to be so much external pressure, pressure from other people. And I wonder if that's a sort of a big driver of stress.
I think it can be, yeah. And I think that's an important kind of clarification, that actually there's different sort of brain networks actually respond to different stressors. So it's kind of interesting to think about that. So one way you can actually think about it is if I go for a run and actually I start running quicker than I typically would, that will actually activate my stress response. But it's not, it's not necessarily like a bad thing. It's, that's for my benefit. It's like my body's helping me to achieve that task. But there'll be a different type of stressor, like for example an exam, and maybe I'm not that concerned about the results, but I might go, ooh, mum or dad or somebody, maybe they'll think less of me, or they'll be annoyed, or whatever it might be. So I might perceive that as a threat to how I'm perceived. So it could be like a status thing, or it could be, or for someone else, it could be like their, kind of threat to ego, like their sense of their own kind of competence, something like that. That could kind of raise the stakes. And then that will actually activate a different, a different set of kind of regions in the brain, in that kind of network. So you can essentially have a sort of more like a physical response, like a physical stress response, and then you can have a sort of a physical combined with a cognitive stress response, typically.
Interesting. And what are the things that ramp up? Are there certain things that ramp up stressors? Or what makes for a really stressful stressor? Is there a universal stressful stressor? Is there a universal list, or is it entirely subjective? Is it entirely down to perception?
I think it's a combination. So some researchers will sort of have what they call like relative stressors, and they're the ones that are very kind of subjective, kind of personal. And then there'll be the sort of like the absolute stressors. And an absolute stressor is when they were saying like everybody is going to have a reaction.
Yeah.
There's nobody who's getting chased by a tiger who's going to be like, I'm cool, calm, collected, in the zone, right? They're going to be having a stress response, even if that was literally their job to be chased by a tiger. Right? So there are some ones we just call like an absolute stressor, where in all likelihood everybody is going to have a stress reaction. And that could be like natural disasters. You think of kind of earthquakes, in some big kind of accident, like your plane crash and that kind of stuff. Everybody's going to have a stress response to that. Whereas a relative stressor could be, I'm late for a meeting, right? One person, they just don't care. So they just kind of casually come in and they'll be like, people just have to wait for me. And then there's someone else who's going, oh my God, I'm going to be late. What are they going to think of me? This is really unprofessional, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that would be more like a kind of a relative stressor. But then there are absolute stressors.
So we're
or
talking
universal, if you want to call it that.
Universal, potentially, yeah. Sorry, I butchered the
No.
We
can use different.
I'm reinventing it as we go.
You know?
So let's talk about relative stress, because that, I think, is the one that seems to line up best with the sort of stress that might affect your well-being when you're already in, quite a nice space, but you're looking to try and, I suppose, live optimally. You're looking to try and be healthy. You want to progress career-wise at work. There's sort of self-actualization going on, and so you, to a degree, you're then inviting stressful situations in order to progress, in order to kind of push forward with whatever it is you're trying to achieve, goals that you have.
So you're inviting stressors or stress?
Well, you tell me.
It's interesting to think about it. It's like, if I'm approaching on these kind of challenges, they're then potentially stressors.
Yeah.
And then I'm likely to have a stress response to those.
Okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So stressors.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a nice way to kind of divvy it up, because another way you could just say is differentiate between like the triggers.
Yeah.
And then the stress response to those triggers is just another way you can think about it. So someone might actually be putting themselves in a situation where they're facing a lot of those kind of triggers, whereas someone else may not. They might go, yeah, I don't fancy all that challenge. Just going to go lie on the beach.
Yeah.
And then essentially their sort of exposure to those triggers as sort of stressors will then diminish quite a bit.
Gotcha. Okay, so let's touch on perception, because you've mentioned that already in terms of how we perceive those stressors. How does that vary from person to person in terms of how we receive that, how we perceive that, and what are the things that make up our perception, if that makes sense?
Yes, I think so. One way to understand is we have our sort of sensory system that's kind of going out into the world, and that's going to be your vision, your hearing, also ability to kind of touch things, sense temperature, all that kind of stuff. So there's constantly information sort of coming in, and essentially there's going to be brain networks that are essentially working collectively, but they're on the lookout for something that they will then perceive as again like a threat or a demand or a challenge, something like that. So that's kind of how it works. If they then pick something up, and again it's really complex stuff, but you could imagine all this information is coming in, and then it's being processed. You could say essentially against the memory system to sort of say, is this familiar to us? Is this unfamiliar? Is this potentially dangerous? Ooh, that reminds me of that thing that was quite dangerous. Or actually it is, it isn't, right? So it's kind of constantly working in the background without our awareness. As soon as it clocks something, then the reaction starts, typically. And it can work in a sort of a real time, in terms of like the threat is here now, or it's got that kind of anticipatory ability to sort of go, this could become a threat or challenge or demand. And that's the kind of example, you're studying for an exam. You're going through the content and you're going, I don't know this. Shh. Well, I've got a couple of, when is it? Tomorrow. I've left it too late. And then you're imagining potentially not really doing that well in the exam, maybe not getting a good grade, some kind of consequence down the line. And that can then activate that stress response. So we can have it sort of in response to like an immediate kind of stressor, or something that we kind of anticipate as a consequence. But it'll still activate the system. And
is that what leaves us feeling anxious if we're looking forward and there's an event coming up that we're perceiving as going to be stressful, then it creates this sort of anxiety, this anxious state, which a lot of people would refer to as stress. Again, just the lumps, it all gets lumped together.
Yeah, absolutely. So if your system perceives in that way, excuse me, what tends to happen is there's a few sort of systems involved in the body. So one system is called the HPA axis, and essentially what that does is it's the hypothalamus, pituitary, and adrenal axis. So those kind of three areas. And then there's another one called the SAM or the SAM axis. But I'll just mention just one to kind of give you a sense of how this works. So what typically happens is when the system perceives, again, the threat, the demand, the challenge, the hypothalamus, which is a little region in the brain, it sends a chemical message to the pituitary gland, which is kind of known as the master gland. And that then sends another chemical message through the bloodstream to the adrenal glands, which sit on top of the kidneys. And what that then does is that encourages them actually to secrete cortisol or adrenaline, which then kind of amps the system.
So that's the sort of fight-flight response.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah. So faster heart rate, sweating,
breathing
rate, all that kind of stuff. Yeah. Okay. So
energy for muscles.
Yeah.
As well. So kind of glucose going into the system, and you're fired up and ready to run.
But that's a bit of an issue if the event is not here yet.
Yeah.
Or if you can't run away from it.
Absolutely.
Okay. So there's an internal response, which is a sort of interaction between your perception and your physiology to a stressor. Mm-hmm. Okay. But then there's also environment.
Is this making sense so far?
It makes sense.
Yeah.
So because then you've got your environment as well. So you've got particularly stressful environment. You've got a lot of stressors coming at you. Mm-hmm. Because if it's just all our perception, the temptation is, if I'm stressed, it's my fault. Mm-hmm. I'm not very good at dealing with stress. But there's got to be context of your environment in there, surely, because as you said at the beginning, there's sort of absolute stressors or universal stressors. There are certain situations in which everyone is going to get stressed. And no matter how good at dealing with stress you are, there are certain environments that are just going to be very stressful.
Yeah, absolutely. It's also additive. So the more kind of stresses you layer on top, the bigger an impact it has on your system. And then there'll be some that are essentially that they're kind of the stressor is sort of transient. So like it comes and goes. And then there are other stressors that are essentially constant. So if you're constantly under kind of financial pressure, you've got this kind of ongoing stressor. If you're constantly at threat of losing your home or being evicted or finding yourself on the street, that stressor doesn't go away. And so again, if your stress response is then just kind of working away, or maybe you're on a really challenging course, you're studying, you constantly feel that you're just kind of hanging on, then again, that kind of stress response is constantly being kind of activated, and that can have sort of an additive effect for people. So there'll be some things that are, potentially like within our ability to sort of, to kind of regulate and manage. But then unfortunately, there are stressors that are very hard to kind of circumvent for people.
Mm. And so there's a difference actually between that sort of chronic stress. Mm-hmm.
And the more acute stress is typically what we call it,
Yeah.
And acute stress can be advantageous. It can have an adaptive function. Like I said with exercise, if I'm training and then I train a little bit harder than I typically will, you'll know this better than me. But hopefully like an adaptation takes place, and so that kind of stress I put under that sort of stress response to my system, it allowed me to kind of achieve that task, and then hopefully then essentially you get over time. You get that sort of adaptation to it. Now, again, if you just put me constantly under strain, like if you just kept saying to me, just lift heavier, just lift heavier, just lift heavier, essentially the strain, I'm just going to snap, is what's going to happen. And that's a sort of similar analogy for the stress response. If you don't get the ability to, down regulate and go back to kind of equilibrium, over time you do get that, what people refer to as kind of like a burnout. Right, where it just kind of goes and goes and goes until it can't go anymore.
Yeah, because there's that real sense that there's an amount of stress that you can cope with, whereby going and getting good night's sleep, going outside and exercising, it deals with the acute phase of that, and you feel recovered and you can go back in and you can take on that stress again, and actually you can stay, you can move through periods of higher stress and lower stress, but you're managing. But then presumably also there's a level of stress where it gets to where your sleep is not restful anymore. You wake up thinking about it. Maybe you dream about work or whatever's stressing you out, and it's kind of constantly on your mind, and it never really leaves you alone, or you're constantly feeling tired. In those sorts of situations, there is presumably just a level of unrecognized, stress that's just affecting the system all the time. It's not actually being picked up or dealt with.
Absolutely, yeah. Excuse me. That's the thing, that sometimes chronic stress, it may not be, the level of the stress in the system may not be as high as an episode of acute stress, but it's sort of running along in the background the whole time. And although the level might not be as high, just the fact that the system is not, having kind of recovery time is what actually, there is then a link to kind of longer term kind of health issues. So that kind of chronic stress, and often it does go unrecognized for people, because it's for a lot of people, it's below that kind of threshold where they sort of recognize it. They're just not as kind of clued into some of those kind of, those kind of symptoms, sensations of that kind of more chronic stress, and that's what can kind of catch people over time.
So this idea of having a threshold, then, if you do have albeit it may be dynamic, it may move over time, it may not be fixed, but if there is a line at which the threshold is unrecoverable, because there's certainly that with training, there's a training volume that is unrecoverable, and it creates damage and maybe puts you in risk of injury. And so if there's a similar thing with stress, if there's quite a high level of chronic stress, surely a smaller stressor is enough to sort of, the straw that broke the camel's back is what comes to mind.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was again the sort of additive idea I was talking about. That you can keep kind of adding things on until actually you struggle, and just the fact that the system is not really getting to switch off and essentially kind of recover actually just makes it vulnerable to actually things that aren't as stressful. And a lot of people have that experience. When they're struggling, they might sort of go, why am I having such a strong reaction to this thing that I used to manage fine? And actually it's because essentially your system is really at that point where it's it's really, really struggling. So and as a consequence it gets confusing, because people start to go, I can't manage as well as I used to, like, what's wrong with me? And it's more to think, actually it's more your system is just really fatiguing right now. And that's actually what, so it's more that, right? It's like it's a bit like someone getting an injury and they sort of go, well, I used to be fine, and it goes, yeah, because you weren't injured then, but you've been working towards the injury, and now you're injured, and so no, you can't do what you did previously. But it's not because there's like kind of it's just the system at that point has kind of just got to the end of the road in a way, and it just needs to recover. So something's got to change ultimately. Yeah,
needs a bit more time, and then change of environment potentially in order to actually fully get back on board. So the benefits, I mean, there's some of the issues with obviously any of those types of stress becoming overwhelming is that you end up in a permanent state of deflated mood. You can obviously become depressed, but it's also just subtly affecting things that really affect your physical health as well as your mental health. So it's subtly affecting your cardiovascular system. It's subtly having an impact on your ability to exercise, approach experiences, enjoy life, because you just always in that state of wanting to, I just need to sit and do nothing for a bit. So you start to withdraw from doing stuff because there's a constant need to recover from what's in your head, I suppose, what's in your mind, what your body's actually going through. So there's plenty of downsides to not being able to regulate that stress response. But I suppose some of the benefits of actually developing a healthy relationship with the stress that you've got around you are that the flip side of that is you actually feel you can go and exercise. You do want to go and meet friends. You're actually taking life on. You're actually up in the morning with energy and actually looking forward to what can I do, where can I go, what experiences can I take on. And that's what we tend to talk about with well-being. So there seems to be this thing of not having no stress in your life, because it's unrealistic to think that your environment is not going to push some stressors your way. And actually, if you're ambitious and you're reaching for goals, you're actually going to be bringing on some stressors deliberately. So you're going to be bringing them in. So you have to be a solid foundation as you go. So it's sort of, then it makes sense that you need to talk about coping strategies to stress, because if you just if you just expect that you're going to be able to cope with everything without actually putting some stress coping mechanisms in deliberately, and you're inviting stressors into your life because you're ambitious, because you want to achieve things, because you want to be well, it's not going to just happen naturally. Your system may become overwhelmed. So in terms of coping strategies, how do you separate them, and what are the different coping strategies that you usually talk about with people?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing to understand is it's really individual. So there's not like a real simple, what are the three things to do? Yeah. So what it does require from a person is actually, it does require a bit of self-reflection to kind of actually just to look at it and try and understand things in a little bit more detail for themselves. But that being said, there are some things that people generally respond to. One thing is really that kind of differentiator. If we're talking more about sort of differentiating between what we might call psychological stress and physical stress. So again, physical stress is the kind of thing I talked about, which could be, if I'm exercising, or if I, for example, in an environment that's really hot, really cold, that can put a physical stress on my body. And so the way we might cope with that then is going, well, if I'm cold, let's layer up. Let's crank up the heating. Like let's do something to actually to work with that sort of stressor, right? When it's more the psychological stress, that's when you want to actually look at it. And some of this is to sort of say to ourselves, look, is this psychological stressor, is it really kind of like the life and death? Is it like really a tiger, right? Or is it like a tiger in my mind? And that does require a bit of work. I mean, you can kind of recognize that logically, but you've actually got to kind of work with that a little bit and go, hang on a minute, how many of these things that I'm responding to are genuinely high stakes? And that for an individual can require a bit of work, because actually they might be high stakes, but they might be high stakes because of their personal history. There might be something within their psyche and their mind that makes something high stakes to them, but actually in the sort of the objective reality of the world is not really high stakes. And so if you can understand that, you've then got a choice ultimately about, do I want to just respond to this as if it is life or death? Don't, like, if I can continue as I have been going, if I don't ace this exam, my life is over. I can continue taking that attitude if I want and understand the stress response we're going to have with that. Or I can start to go, well, okay, if it doesn't go well, that's going to be disappointing. But actually, ultimately, I can go again. I dust myself down, go again. So that ability to kind of reframe things, to kind of look at things, that is something that people do generally respond to. But it's something that's got to feel right to you. And again, it's very individual. So like I said, what may not be a big deal for one person is a really big deal for someone else. And it's not really, if I was working with somebody, it wouldn't be for me to tell them that. You've just got to sort of understand that in the context of a person's history, whatever it might mean. But the person does ultimately have that choice to go in and sort of go, I've got that option to kind of look at things again and see actually through reframing, seeing the kind of the bigger picture, that might actually sort of reduce the degree to which I perceive something as like, a threat or a demand or challenge. And then you have the consequent reduction in the body's stress response over time.
Is it difficult to get that clarity of thought when you're already quite highly stressed?
Yeah, that is part of the problem. Yeah. If someone is really stressed, like whether it's acute or whether it's kind of chronic stress that's just been impacting them for a long time, absolutely, like your perceptual ability gets impacted. Your kind of higher level thinking can get impacted. You can develop this kind of real narrow focus. So it's almost like if you get like a kitchen roll and you look through the tube, that's kind of how you see the world. And so you're kind of swinging this kind of tube around, and just whatever you see is everything, and you just sort of miss the big picture. But that's that kind of threat focus, which again made a lot of sense. If you're like, there's the tiger, and someone's trying to talk to you, and it's like, I don't hear you, mate. I'm keep my eye on the tiger. it makes sense to be able to do that, but we can get locked into that. So we're just seeing everything in that kind of way. So the email comes through, I'm like, oh my God, got to get on it, right? Or, someone asks you for a meeting, you're like, got to respond. Instead of going, they can wait. It's okay, the world's not going to end. What's the big picture? People are sometimes panicking in response to, trying to please somebody who they're actually, paying to do a service. It's this kind of funny thing. It's like, why are you sort of panicking and feeling you've got to get back to like the salesperson? There's all these kind of situations that people can, you lose sight of because you're in this real kind of narrow focus. Everything is a threat. And if you can slow it down and sort of expand the awareness, you start to see things in a bit more of a realistic, proportionate kind of way. But it's hard, like when you're really in it, sometimes it's hard to get yourself out. And that's honestly like where you need help from.
Well, that's what I was going with it, because there's obviously an entire industry, your industry around psychology, and psychology has been around for as well as long as humans have, and so that aspect of, if it was as easy as just knowing what to look for, it potentially wouldn't require as much training and as much research and then as much practice working with individuals as it does to become a very good therapist, is to be able to kind of get in there and have these insights. So there are probably things that everybody can do on their own that will help them to be able to deal with their stress. And there's probably also stuff that you can't really do on your own, and you're actually much better off going to see someone and hire a coach and have them chat to you and maybe give you some inspiration and give you some things to think about that might bring those things out. With that sort of self-work that you can do, obviously you talked about reframing already. Are there other things, ways of being able to manage the symptoms of stress that individuals can kind of do on their own?
Absolutely. I mean, the physical symptoms, you can manage the symptoms, relatively well if you know what to do. So this again, can help with training, but people will respond to slightly different things due to individual preferences. But exercise is a good one, just in terms of you want to get that energy out of the system. You want to think about if you've had that physical stress response, it's mobilized you, to take action. Now the thing is, in the past where I'd be mobilized, I'd then run. It's that kind of fight-flight thing that people refer to. But nowadays you could have it in the office. You're in a meeting and you've got this fight-flight system activating, but you're sitting in a chair, so you've got all this energy, but it's not getting released. And so that's where exercise can come in for people. But it doesn't actually have to be crazy. It could be walking up and down a flight of stairs a couple of times. Could be going for a brisk walk. Could be it could be going for a run. You don't need to go absolutely to town on it, but you're just giving yourself an opportunity to kind of release a little bit of that energy. Some people might find just doing some push-ups, doing some squats will kind of get some of that energy out. Unfortunately, what typically happens is a lot of the times when we're having the stress response, we're often not in the environment where it might feel sort of socially appropriate to engage in some of those things. So if I'm in that stressful meeting, to sort of go, I really fancy running on the spot now to get the energy out. Or doing some push-ups.
It takes a brave person.
You're in the middle of doing a presentation, right? Or whatever it might be. That's the problem. It's I can't actually do it right now in the moment. That's where there are some other practices that are a little bit more subtle, like doing kind of breathing practice. Can be quite a nice one just to help to kind of take the edge off, or some more kind of subtle kind of tense and release exercises can be quite beneficial. Now you can do those in your own time as well, but there are some strategies you can use actually in certain situations, getting kind of on top of your kind of breathing in that scenario. But what will really help with that is obviously developing a practice so that you can default to it when you're in that situation, right? It's you don't learn to swim in a storm, that kind of idea. It's hopefully not, right? You learn to swim in a pool or somewhere where the water's nice and calm. But once you've got the technique down, you can then apply it in a more challenging situation. So that would be another one that can be quite a nice one. Some people find practices, like yoga, Tai Chi, could be dance, could be singing, choir, can be art. There's a whole range of different things. And it's really about kind of finding what works for you, because what one person finds relaxing, another person actually might find stress-inducing. That's again back to this kind of relative thing. Like if you said to another person, one person you might say, how do you like to relax? They might go, I love to dance. But you could put someone else in that situation, and they might feel sort of really socially conscious or awkward, or it's just not their thing. So that's actually going to stress them out. So again, very individual. What would it be? So some of it is kind of knowing yourself, and actually, if you're not so sure, it's actually trying a few things and just see what sort of works, what works for you.
Yeah, I definitely find that with exercise for sure. You find that interestingly in dancers, they use stretching for so many different things. Actually, as a tool, it's so well developed in their arsenal that, you know, they'll stretch out stressful situations. They'll go and stretch. It's kind of like it has that therapeutic effect. But also they use it for performance. They use it to help with choreography. Like there's just so many different reasons, and often they're quite injured, so they'll use it for recovery. You know, it's just it becomes a tool with a use for everything. Whereas for some people, you go in the weights room and they like lifting really heavy. You know, just kind of get out that way. Boxing pads. Some people really like to go and channel the anger. Yeah, that kind of stuff.
It's whatever works for you, just so long as you're not doing kind of more damage.
Yeah,
is would be like the tip, right? Because that's going to be a bit sort of self-defeating if you kind of cause yourself some damage. So having some of those kind of techniques, to actually, what can I do to kind of reduce that stress response? Or another way to understand it is actually, we talk about stress response, but the other way to think about it is what I'm looking to do is I'm looking to activate my relaxation response. And that's the other way to understand it. Because we keep talking about stress, but actually you're like, well, what's the other bit? What's the relaxation? And so actually it's like, what can I do to activate the relaxation response? And that's what like doing the slow breathing, those kind of practices can actually help with. So what I'm doing is I'm going for the relaxation response to kind of counter the stress response. Yeah. And that can just be quite a nice one. So ultimately that's what we're looking to do. And that can help. But I think the other piece to sort of go, if my stress response is constantly being kind of triggered, and it doesn't, and maybe it's been triggered in a way that's not, if I'm able to step back as best as I can, if I feel like it's being triggered to a level of intensity and duration that doesn't really feel proportionate to the trigger, like if I'm almost able to say to myself objective, like, why am I getting so stressed about this? I can't quite get it. That's again where potentially getting some help, could actually help to kind of elucidate or understand what might be going on, because it could be that the threat is actually unconscious. We're not really recognizing what it's about. And our kind of thinking sort of rational mind is going, I may not really understand it. It's like, I'm kind of saying to myself, it's like not that big a deal, but I'm still reacting as if it's a really big deal. Like, what's going on? And then it's possible that it's a kind of an unconscious thing that's going on. Like it's maybe just linked to something that goes a little bit deeper for us. Maybe goes back to kind of our early history, or links to something in the past that was maybe quite a challenging or kind of traumatic event for us. And that's why it might be evoking something that just doesn't quite, make sense to a kind of rational brain, because it's just a bit hidden from view.
So a lot of time I hear that described as the kind of root cause. I suppose you kind of going after the root of it. Is that exactly right to say that? Because you could say that the root cause, I mean, I think it's tempting sometimes to say the root cause of the problem is that person at work. That's the root cause of the problem, right? There's a temptation to look externally. The root cause of the problem is definitely my boss.
It's definitely my boss, yeah.
But that's, I suppose we've talked about quite a bit about the symptoms up until this point. But I suppose you're maybe alluding there to going after the root cause of it a little bit more.
So again, if it's the kind of it's my boss, of course you can sort of go, it's my boss, and that's the kind of the shorthand way we could talk about it. Like, my boss is really difficult, or my boss is really challenging. But the bit to understand is, okay, so the boss does something, right? Like there's some kind of behavior we're assuming, or something from the boss, or a way you perceive the boss. So here's the thing: you perceive your boss in a particular kind of way, and then that's what actually causes your reaction. So there is the kind of there's the trigger, there's how you perceive the trigger, and then there's your response. So it's in that space is where you've got that option to do some work. Now you could do the in the physical world you could sort of say something to the boss. You could find a new place to work. There are those kind of things you could do, but you can also try and understand, okay, what is it within me that's causing me to have that kind of reaction to the person?
Yeah,
and that's potentially where we can do some work. And I think, again, when you're at that ability of actually working on that kind of perception, that's ultimately what can result in you actually having a stress response that is of sort of less intensity and shorter duration. And so in a way, you don't have to become as reliant on those kind of techniques to keep constantly moving yourself to the relaxation response, because actually you're not getting as stressed to begin with. Right? So another way you could think about that would be the difference between like if you have, you know, like a smoke detector or like kind of fire alarm. So there's the sensor that picks up the smoke, you know, the fire, the heat, and then there's the alarm that starts to ring. And in a way, what we're doing, and just for this example, just understand that like the symptoms are like the alarm, that kind of ring, right? Because it's helping me to respond to the threat. What the techniques often do is they are sort of reducing the alarm. It's not as loud, right? I'm quietening the alarm. But what do we do about the sensor? Because if I start to recognize that I'm constantly having to turn this alarm system off, it keeps going on all the time. It's got like this really sensitive trigger. That's, you've got the option to do a bit of work and see, is there something I can do in that space to make essentially that kind of sensor less kind of sensitive to particular things. And that's sometimes I think where kind of, you know, psychology, you know, therapy, coaching can come into play.
That can make a massive difference, because I think if there are some things in your environment that are going to be that are always going to be there. And so I think if you can imagine a life in which the things that currently stress you out and detract from your health, your well-being, your enthusiasm for day to day, you just imagine a life in which you do some work on those things, and then you become someone who actually just walks towards those situations. It just doesn't affect you in the same way. I think that's really powerful to try and connect with as an idea, that there are, because I think there's a temptation to look at other people, not know their backstory. It's very difficult to sort of see stress across the room. And so to imagine that when you look around the room, everybody you're seeing has got it together, that they seem to be handling those moments, because you're not in their mind, you're not in their body, you're not actually experiencing what they're experiencing. You're just inferring that it must be easy for them because they don't seem to be having some major meltdown from the outside, nothing visible. And so then relative to what I'm experiencing, this is, you know, I'm the only one who's really stressed by this. Really isolating. They kind of leave you feeling like, you know, some way you're struggling and therefore you're not able to cope, but everybody else is. And I think that's really hard. But if you can imagine just actually doing some work on that, investing some money and some time into working on those things with somebody who's professional at doing that, and then you keep those skills with you for life, then it's not like you suddenly forget the sessions that you've had, or you suddenly can't use the skills that you've learned. Is you've got that toolbox then to just approach new situations that with a bit more confidence.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can also pass on one of those tools. You know, you can help other people. And I think that's, you know, as how do I say, as much as an advocate I am for you know, all the one-to-one work. I mean, I think one of the reasons why there, you know, people are actually suffering a lot, I think, is actually it's that sort of, probably historically we had more of a sense of community, and there's more kind of a co-regulation, and that ability of actually in groups sharing your kind of struggles and having those kind of validated by other people, you know, sharing that kind of experience, having kind of a collective regulation system almost. And I think we're just a little bit more fragmented now, and I think that also kind of plays a part in this. But I think absolutely anything you can learn, you can also use that with other people, and you can kind of share essentially in that kind of co-regulating of things. You know, that ability that actually, if you know, I'm in a room with somebody and they're very stressed, you know, part of actually part of, you know, how I actually help them to relax is actually by being relaxed myself. Which might sound strange. So part of it is to sort of go, well, part of my job is to stay on top of my own stress response. Because, you know, sometimes I could be dealing with something that's very, very challenging, right? You might go, wow, okay, this is really challenging stuff. Okay, what do we do here? You know, if I stay on top of my sort of stress response, if I can kind of, you know, you maintain that sort of ability to sort of, essentially because I stay calm under pressure, often what happens is, in the kind of, in that sort of sensory system we have, the person actually, system, it's often non-conscious, through non-verbal language, all sorts of things, they're kind of picking up that you're safe, that we're safe. It's like, oh, he's pretty chilled. His voice is quite calm and even, or there's some warmth in his voice that doesn't sound quite so kind of threatening. And then actually the person's nervous system will often settle over time, or at least, it kind of takes it down a step or two. And it just kind of brings it down a little bit. And so actually anything you learn for yourself, you can also, the added benefit is you can also help others. So, if you're a parent and you have children, by being able to stay on top of your own stress response and kind of stay, measured in challenging situations, if you have kids, you kind of help them to stay more kind of settled as well. And then actually, essentially, they will kind of learn how to regulate themselves through kind of observation in a way. So it's really kind of win-win.
Yeah,
I think.
Yeah, so you can
or any relationship as well, partners, friendships, husband, wife, whoever, right? You can, if both people lose it at the same time, doesn't tend to end that well.
No.
Whereas at least if one or both can actually just be regulating themselves and then just responding in a sort of more open kind of less defensive sort of way, it tends to actually lower the other person's guard as well.
Yeah, because you don't actually have to actively be trying to teach somebody else, but just actually modelling it, modelling the behaviour.
Great word, yeah.
And then other people will are more likely to follow.
Yeah,
because they feel
yeah.
That's really interesting. The other thing is, of course, talking about it as well, and there's a bit more of a movement towards that. You hear more of that in the media these days, and there's been a focus on men talking more about their feelings, talking about feeling stressed. I'm a bit divided on it, because I can absolutely see the benefits of divulging when you're feeling stressed with somebody else, because you make yourself vulnerable to that person. My experience is everyone will take you up on the offer of being sensible about that. I think very, very few people will take an opportunity to abuse that. I think if you genuinely open up to someone, everyone wants to be supportive because they want to be seen to be that way, and it's quite an honour if somebody does decide to open up to you. It's quite a nice thing. They obviously trust you.
Yep.
But also there's a kind of talking about your stress which is habitual. So when people say talking about your stress, I just wonder if you've got any views on this as well, because that thing of just repeating, I'm stressed, I'm stressed, I'm stressed, is not the same as talking about it to find a solution. And I think I would make that distinction, is that if you find yourself in the habit of just going, oh, I'm so stressed all the time, you might not actually be doing anything to solve it.
Well, if interesting, like what if I substituted the word stress for hungry? What if I kept saying that to you?
Eat some food.
Right? I'm hungry. Oh, I'm so hungry. I'm hungry. At what point do people go, all right, well, there are solutions.
Yeah.
So you're right. Like if you're just kind of using the word I'm stressed, it depends who the person's sharing with, but you're not really going into that much detail. It's like, well, what are you stressed about? It's kind of hard for people to, I think, to respond in a sort of in a helpful way. And it's pretty hard to actually validate it. Because if someone goes, I'm stressed, yeah, that sucks. Or you might go, me too.
The default response.
Yeah, me too, But if the person if they're a little bit more specific, then you're more likely to evoke a positive response from somebody. I think just on that point, I think there is a little bit of a difference between a more sort of a heartfelt, kind of taking the risk or being courageous to kind of, lower your guard, be vulnerable, share something, with somebody, versus that kind of oversharing you might see on social media a little bit, which I don't think is as helpful, because it's hard to know if the person is really connected with their feelings when they're doing that, or if they're just they're firing off this kind of story to lots of people in the hope that they're going to get some kind of they're going to get some kind of like a response, like, some kind of, whether it's attention or something else, and I think that's something that you can see where can be a little bit of a misunderstanding. So when we talk about opening up and sharing, that doesn't mean I have to go on social media and tell everybody all the most kind of intimate parts of of my life. I think that's where we can actually hurt ourselves. So it's really about, taking a chance to share with somebody who we sort of feel safe with. And if we don't have that much experience of that, if someone's like, well, I haven't really felt safe with anybody, it's hard, and it's about almost becoming a little bit discerning than about being able to tell the difference between the people who are kind of safe to open up to. And one way you can do that is to sort of, it's almost like dipping your toe in. So you don't need to kind of share your deepest kind of vulnerabilities. You could sort of go, well, if the person asks me how I'm doing, I could just give my, yeah, fine, how are you? What if I give him like 10% more and see how he responds? What if I give her like 20% more and see how she responds, see how they respond? Don't need to go like 100% in and then realize I've just shared with somebody who just doesn't really care. And then I'm feeling all kind of, essentially like devalued and rejected. And I'm like, right, that's the last time I make myself vulnerable to anybody. Everyone's awful, And it's not that. It's just that, some people are they are just, for whatever reason, their capacity to be sort of empathetic or compassionate, to be open to receive, difficult things from people is just, it's better than others. And sometimes it's a job of actually discerning that. And that's what makes it a bit hard, and some people are just better than others. So I would generally, as a sort of a rule of thumb, lowering the guard and allowing ourselves to be vulnerable and share a little bit more can be great. And actually having that sort of experience validated can sometimes actually reduce the stress response. I mean, think about if I'm sitting there by myself and I've got some deadline from my manager and I'm getting really kind of stressed because I'm thinking, oh, this is going to be really tough. They're going to think X, Y, Z. If I allowed myself to be a little bit more vulnerable, now it's going to depend on maybe what you know of the manager, but there might be benefit actually in sharing that with them and going, hey, I'm actually kind of struggling to meet the deadline. I'm getting really stressed about it. They might just go, don't worry about it. The deadline's just kind of arbitrary. It's just to have the target to aim for, because if we don't have them, we don't do it. But, don't worry about it. If it's next week, it's fine. So actually, there is a benefit to kind of opening up and sharing with people as well, because it manages just in that practical way, because it just reframes or recalibrates our perception. Oh, got some new information. Now it's not such a big thing. In the same way also, that actually trying things, that's sort of facing something that is a little bit sort of challenging to myself. It might be initially challenging, but then, I manage it and I get this kind of positive feedback that I could do it. My confidence kind of builds a little bit. So then the next time when I approach it, doesn't actually cause the same level of stress, or it might actually, what might trigger me is the other aspect of stress, where we haven't touched on so much, is what's called eustress, which is spelled EU and then the word stress. Excuse me. And that's seen as the more kind of positive stress, whereas I think the stress we've been talking about is more would be seen as the kind of the negative, if that makes sense. But that sort of positive stress, that sort of excitement of facing a challenge. And again, we've always got that, like, excuse me, we can always kind of learn from taking those kind of steps, approaching things a little bit difficult. And that's how we learn that we can kind of, we can improve, and we can kind of face challenges.
Yeah, because actually that eustress idea of sort of, I suppose that kind of positive stress is the physiological sensations that are associated with excitement, also associated with stress as well. So you get that same increase in heart rate, increase in blood pressure, pupil dilation, more alertness, more attention paid to what's happening. So actually they are, the blueprints of them physiologically are very, very similar.
Yeah.
And so that reframing job, actually, if you feel competent and confident, stressful situations can feel exciting, because you think you're looking optimistically at the positive outcome.
Yeah.
You're thinking, this is a challenge, but I feel ready to take it on.
Yeah.
So all of those same physiological things that are happening in your body are perceived very differently by your mind, and you're like, let's go.
Absolutely.
Let's do it.
And that's actually how some people really learn to harness the stress response to their advantage. Because if you think about what it is, it's like it's my body is prepping me to face this challenge or this demand. And actually it's doing that essentially by turbocharging my system. Like it's making me quicker, faster, stronger. Like that's what it's doing. So it's like, if that was a drug, If someone was like, hey, before this event, if I gave you this little tablet and it's going to make you 20% fitter, faster, stronger, would you take it? 20% sharper? I mean, that would cost a lot of money, that drug. All right? But because it often gets framed as a little bit, we conflate it a little bit, and it's not surprising that we do this, but what can also be helpful sometimes is to understand that my stress response is my body prepping me to manage what's coming. It's not a sign of a negative outcome. Because it hasn't actually happened. Like it is part of an alarm system, like it is kind of alerting me to like a potential danger or threat, or as you said, but it's also prepping me to manage it. And so that's the bit. So it's almost to go, this response to my body, all this kind of energy, this is going to actually minimize the likelihood of that bad thing happening if I harness it. And I think when you frame it in that way, you're like, this is my turbocharger. Let's do this. That can be quite nice.
Yeah, but far more energizing and far more likely to make you move towards that whatever challenge is rather than try and avoid it, which is kind of what I wanted to talk about as well. But
can I just say one thing? Sorry.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
But of course, I don't want to minimize, the contextual nature. Like if somebody is afraid of losing their home or bills like that, I wouldn't kind of frame it as a kind of a let's turbocharge this thing. No. But it might be sort of going, it could be giving me some energy to try and take some kind of action potentially if I use that energy. But then if that option's not there, it could be quite difficult. Yeah,
it's got to be realistic. I suppose it's got to be applied in the right context. But
yeah,
but it is important, I think, to stress the opposite side of the equation, because if stress is just always seen as a negative in every conversation where it comes up, in every podcast, in every media outlet, it's hard to get away from that idea if that's all you're hearing, if that's all you're exposed to. You're not hearing messages around stress as being something that you can utilize almost like a tool that can make you better in certain circumstances. Yeah. So I think it is important. But it does lead me on to my point, because there are, and you mentioned this before off air, but there's kind of passive and active ways of dealing with stress. And I just love the list of passive ways of dealing with stress, because they're all like pints at the pub. For some people, cigarettes, Netflix. Even socializing when it's happening as a sort of escapism, socializing, there's, I suppose, different ways of going at it. But that whole list of stuff, the hedonistic escapism stuff, where it's, I just need to change the way I'm feeling now in the quickest way possible, and tried and tested methods come back time and time again. And the way I have this conversation with a lot of clients from a personal training point of view is around lifestyle. It's around lifestyle. So it's a gradual change of lifestyle towards one that you want, where you maximize all the positives and you minimize any negatives. So going out drinking at the pub is great for relaxation. Having a cigarette for smokers, great for relaxation. But it brings with it other things too. Whereas some of the more active methods of where you have to actively go and try and relax, you're actively chasing it. The drawbacks of those often don't tend to be the physical ones, but they tend to be that it takes time away from other things. So, or it takes energy to go in and actually give that time and give your energy, give your awareness to those things. And it takes you away from other activities that are part of your lifestyle or part of your day that you're quite attached to, but might not actually be that good for you. That's a really hard process, I find, to change that over time for people. Do you talk to people about those passive and active kind of methods? Yeah, absolutely. Whether I talk about it in that way or slightly different language, but absolutely. And the interesting thing is a few of the first ones you mentioned, things like drinking, smoking. Well, because what's kind of interesting with those is they often provide a sort of a short-term relief for people. But if you overindulge, the irony is that they actually cause more stress. Yeah. Because actually, if you're hungover, that is a stressor. Like that's a physical stressor on your body. Smoking too much. That's you're putting strain on the system. So there's something kind of interesting about that. A lot of these those kind of quick go-tos for people. Although I might be sort of using it to kind of manage a psychological stressor, or a stressor that's impacting me sort of psychologically. The interesting thing is it might actually impact me in a physical way the next day or later on,
And then also ultimately like psychologically again as well. Because again, if you're hungover or something like that, and as your system kind of processes, it's getting the alcohol out of the system. People often talk about how their mood dips, they feel more anxious, stressed, things like that. So it doesn't tend to kind of work as well. Whereas interestingly, those kind of passive ones, those more active kind of ones, they do require a bit more effort. It's like there's no such thing as a free lunch, seemingly. I think we're back to that one. They do require a bit more work, but the rewards are generally worth the effort, I find. And I think it's just starting small and sort of building. And I think one tip for people would be that what our brain and system and I think our minds, what we really don't like is to have things taken away from us without being replaced. It's like it's like an exchange. It's like, oh, you're taking my cigarettes from me. Well, what am I getting?
Health and longevity. No, not good enough.
No, that seems really far away.
Well, because
but if you replace it with something else,
right? Well, some of those things, it's like they're acting as a crutch, and so if you just come and sweep them away wholesale, you are literally whipping a crutch away from someone, and they're going to fall.
Yeah.
And I think that's sometimes what happens when people try to do it on their own. Is I tried to remove this thing, whatever it is, whether it's a food, a behavior, whatever, socializing, drinking, whatever. I tried to remove this thing in an attempt to become healthier. But because there was not the awareness there that the reason it was in there was because it was a stress coping mechanism. Then when it was removed, stress ramps up. And then, of course, what happens is you go back to that coping strategy. So, you try and stick with it for a little while, but then you kind of go back to it after a while. And usually with coaching, that's the point at which I encounter someone. Because, because there's been an attempt and they've gone, it didn't work. And that's why I find the holistic nature of when I'm talking to someone about exercise and fitness, and I'm talking to them about lifestyle. It's completely inseparable from their relationship with stress. Well, because when you try to change something in somebody's lifestyle, you have to understand it might be a way of dealing with other things that they're stressed about. It often has a purpose.
Absolutely, yeah. We don't do anything for no reason. I would say is a rule of thumb, right? There's always going to be a reason, and sometimes it's understanding that it's it's a part of like a bigger picture. And yeah, absolutely. Like if you take away, like if someone's way to kind of regulate, or if you want to call it the crutch, whatever they're kind of using it for, if they haven't replaced it with something that's kind of equally effective, or if they haven't actually addressed the source of that particular stress, then absolutely over time you're probably more likely to gravitate back to the thing right? That's just kind of what the brain will do. It'll keep kind of signaling to the person, oh, but drinks, they're pretty good. Your friends in the pub, and you catch up with them too. Be good social. It'll find a way to bring you back, and unless you've actually, picked up, developed a different tool, or like I said, find a way actually to address that source of stress.
All right. Okay. I'm aware that I could talk about this all day. Let's wrap up for people listening. Are there questions that you would typically ask someone, or questions that somebody could pose to themselves that might actually allow someone to begin to do some self-work around stress, around their relationship with stress, that would give an indication of actually something that they might be aware of but don't often give much time to think about? Are there things that you perhaps might start somebody off with at the beginning of therapy sessions, if they've not done that sort of thing before, and stress is the main thing they've come in for, that people listening could take home, could kind of ask themselves and like say, sort of start them down that road?
Yeah, I think it's again very individual, but I would usually start, like if someone was saying to me that they felt that they're very stressed, the questions would be quite simple to start with, in terms of, do you have a sense of what might be triggering it, like what's going on for you? So just getting a sense of the person's life that's often how we start. If the person was kind of less clear, I might be sort of asking somebody, so okay, when do you recognize feeling the most stressed? Is it, what time of day is it? Is it kind of mornings, afternoon, nighttime? When is it that you kind of recognize this in your system? And then, of course, you can follow up by going, okay, what are you doing at those particular times? So if someone's going, well, I'm really stressed between kind of late morning and early evening, Monday to Friday, and actually the weekends aren't too bad. Well, what are you doing in that time? Like, oh, I'm at work. Okay. So, you kind of zone in. And again, the other thing you might then do is you would look for you to ask for specific examples. Can you give me a specific time when you recognize yourself feeling very stressed? I need to look at that. And again, you're just kind of looking for patterns. So there's some of the questions people can ask themselves is just so like, am I aware in different areas of my life where my stress is kind of coming from? Again, it can be additive. So, for a lot of people looking at sort of life domains, like you might go, okay, if I'm working, is it in the workspace? If I'm in a relationship, is it relationship based? Well, that could be, partner, it could be friends, family. If I'm a parent and have children, do I feel like it's a little bit in that space? And that can kind of zone you in, and you can start to kind of look at things and go, okay, what area is, if you almost like imagine a pie, how big are the individual slices, would you say? And you can kind of look at those kind of areas and say, okay, where is it that is, possible kind of to target? Sometimes asking friends, I know I talked a little obviously about going to see like a therapist, but sometimes friends, family members, if you feel safe enough to kind of open up to them, it's amazing the kind of feedback they can give you, because they'll observe you a lot, and they might sort of point some things out to you. Again, they may not be so reluctant to do it unless you kind of give them the green light to sort of say, this is solicited feedback. But just be wary. Some people might just take it as an opportunity to kind of really go, I need to do this and this and this. But generally speaking, some people might actually point some good things out to you. Like they might go, yeah, you get really tensed up before you've got like a presentation to do, or you find you're really distant on Sunday. You're okay on Saturday, but Sunday, like just, when you start thinking about the working day, like Sunday early evening, you start to get all in your head. That kind of stuff. People can sometimes point those things out to us. So there's if you feel safe to do so, it can be a good opportunity to kind of solicit a bit of feedback from people who know you well. That can be another one, because that can also kind of put you on the on that kind of path to understanding things a little bit. But if you go down that route, just it's a little bit buyer beware. Yeah, buyer beware. You may hear some things that are maybe not the most comfortable.
I know there are things that people can pay attention to when they feel stressed, either physical symptoms. Are there things that you would encourage people to check in with to try and build that awareness of what stress actually looks like?
Absolutely, yeah. In terms of the physiological one, absolutely. So again, people can do a bit of kind of training. You can learn a little bit of this yourself, but it can also be good to have someone kind of help you with it. Those kind of common sort of symptoms. Everyone's kind of, or sensations, should I say? There's a lot of overlap from person to person, but there's a bit of individuality in it. But I would be looking for things like, typically, if I'm feeling stressed, depending on the level of it, if it's more acute and high, you're probably going to notice that your heart rate is a bit elevated, your breathing might be a bit more rapid, you might feel like it's kind of higher up in the chest, you may potentially feel hot and sweaty. Those are kind of symptoms that are sort of associated with with that sort of the HPA axis I talked about earlier, and that sort of sympathetic branch of the nervous system, which is a little bit like the accelerator pedal, and it's kind of amping you up. Other things would be kind of muscle tension. Do I feel like kind of quite tensed a lot of the time? Like if people are saying things like, oh, my jaw's quite tight, neck, shoulders, things like that, that's often that just kind of tension in the system. It's almost like if you imagine like a sprinter before a race, they're just tensing up to go. And it's almost like we're like that, and we're sort of just waiting to, it's like the system just waiting to go. So that kind of muscle tension can be another thing to be on the lookout for. Less common ones that, or less commonly understood, but which can be a sign of, quite high unregulated stress, could be, gastro issues, so kind of digestive issues. Some people might get like kind of nausea. Some people might also have like real difficulty kind of concentrating. They might feel like they're almost a bit spacey. That sort of dissociative kind of space that some people talk about. That can also be a sign of like very high unregulated stress in the system. And so what I try and do often when I work with somebody, if that's a sort of something they're coming for help with, we would essentially do like a stress assessment, or what some people might call like an anxiety assessment. and it'll be sort of going through kind of symptoms that they recognize and sort of understanding when they have them, when they don't. And then that starts to give you a sense of whether the symptoms are more likely to be as a consequence of their stress response, or whether they might have like an organic reason it could be more sort of medical based. And one of the ways that I would sort of get a bit more confidence that they were more sort of stress that was kind of psychological in nature is the way they might come on and off. You know, for example, like if someone goes, well, I get all these symptoms when I have to do a presentation, but most of the time at work I don't have any of these symptoms, then you go, well, it's probably not an organic issue, because that timing is kind of interesting, that it would just come on under those particular conditions. You know, like if someone has, you know, diabetes, for example, it doesn't just come on, you know, just like when they're at work and then it's off, right? So it's like that. So that's often how you get that sense of whether the symptoms are more likely to be sort of psychological in nature.
Amazing.
All right.
That's great. Thank you very much. I've enjoyed it. I've enjoyed that immensely.
That's been fun.
Hopefully everyone at home's learned a lot. I'm going to try and play us out in the jingle, but I've forgotten which button it is. So this is a bit of a lottery of soundboards.
Here we
now.
go.
We'll see. It's not that one.
Oh, is that my grade, was it?
I don't think it's that one either. All right.
Let's try that again.
Should we try this one?
Oh, that's good.
Oh, we've got the outro sorted.
That's good. That feels like an accomplishment. That kind of like it went well.
We've got it. Until next time.
Okay. Thank you.
See you.